In the year 2034, the President of the United States is a woman. Jonas Brothers songs are considered classics. And the world is about to go to war.
If there is a villain in this book, the villain is war itself. And if there's a message, the message is that war should be avoided at all costs.
And Elliot Ackerman knows war. He is a decorated U.S. Marine who did 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, winning a Bronze Star, Silver Star, and a Purple Heart. But Ackerman is also a journalist and a novelist, and his new book is 2034, a novel of the next World War, co-authored with Admiral James Stavridis. The trouble begins in the South China Sea.
We are very much entering into a type of new Cold War with China, but the frontier is not just nuclear, it also includes cyber.
2034 tells a harrowing tale that begins with the crew of a U.S. destroyer checking out what they think is a burning fishing trawler, but it's not. At the same time, a Marine aviator is flying an F-35, testing new stealth technology near Iran, when he suddenly loses the ability to control his plane. Sounds like a computer glitch, but it's not. By the end of the first chapter, 3 U.S. warships are at the bottom of the ocean, and the Marine pilot is a prisoner in Iran. 2 seemingly unconnected events that turn out to be very much related. They are the beginning of a war with China that escalates into a world war. Yes, it's fiction, but given the credentials of the authors, it can also be taken as a warning.
If America right now is continuing to tell itself a story about American global dominance, our lack of susceptibility to any threat, and that there is no nation on earth that can compete with us militarily or economically, and we continue to be the single great power in the world, that is probably a story that is going to get us in a lot of trouble.
Elliot Ackerman, thanks very much for joining us. Before we get started, we want to let folks know that your book, 2034, is available at Left Bank Books here in the Central West End. So how do you classify this book? Is it fiction or prediction?
I think it's cautionary tale is probably the best way to classify it. So, it's a work of speculative fiction. Imagine what war would look like started by the United States and China in 2034, the aforementioned year of the title.
We could put it off to 2043, would be okay with me. It sounds pretty dreadful. You are a journalist as well as an author and many other things. Had you given any consideration to attacking this topic from a nonfiction point of view first, or did you decide that there had to be a great fiction book in this and you wanted to jump into that?
I think a lot has been written in the nonfiction realm in journalism and in policy papers around issues of a rising China, but I think far less had been written in terms of fiction, character-based narratives. And it was also the fundamental of this book was the idea of adding to, what had once been kind of a rich shelf of speculative fiction around the Third World War. Books like The Third World War by General John Hackett, or films like Dr. Strangelove. And that type of speculative storytelling, I would argue, is one of the things that actually kept us out of a war, because we had so richly imagined the consequences that we had come to a mutual conclusion with our Soviet adversaries that such a war would be completely devastating and not in anybody's best interests.
Is that why you chose a year that's in the future, but not way, way off in the future? That's, 13 years from now. You could have written it any time, and I suppose the further out you made it, the more fanciful it could have become as far as the technology and so forth.
Well, interestingly enough, when the project began, the date was a little bit more fuzzy. And I've done a number of books, and my books always come kind of in 2 variants. One's where the title is immediately obvious from the beginning, and one where the title only comes much later. And this book was at the latter category. The title came much later. So So part of the process of writing this book was it began kind of in the 2050s, 2060s, but the more got into the story, the more that date kind of almost like a tide coming up the beach, kind of like getting closer and closer to our toes. And we've done so much work talking about, when is this exactly, that we realized, it's in the year 2034. And oh, by the way, this is also going to be the title of the book.
Well, some interesting things going on in 2034, World War notwithstanding. One of the things that I thought was interesting is that you have very strong female characters in here, two military commanders who play critical roles, and the President of the United States is a woman. Is she the first woman president? Do we know? I know she doesn't have a political party.
Well, I think the fact that she doesn't have a political party is far more interesting than the idea that she is a woman. I mean, I would be astounded if by the year 2034 we hadn't had at least one female president. And we don't say specifically in the book whether she's the first or the second or the third. But to me, that seems far less remarkable. And if one wanted to tell a credible story of what a war would look like with China in 2034, the depiction of the U.S. military is absolutely going to contain a number of very central female characters, because that is what the U.S. military looks like right now. For instance, one of the key characters in the book is a woman named Admiral Sarah Hunt. And her backstory is she comes out of naval special warfare, being part of one of the first generations of female SEALs. And that is happening right now. So to make this book credible, if the cast of characters looked like the cast of characters from like the film Midway or something, I don't think that would be a realistic depiction of what our military is going to look like in the next decade.
I was asking particularly about the president because it seemed to me that the president may be making some decisions based on the idea that she doesn't want to appear weak because she is a woman, and some people would still interpret that as a weakness to worry about.
I would say it's less that she is worried about appearing weak necessarily because she's a woman, but just because all presidents fear being weak. Actually, in writing that part, the person who I was sort of thinking of, or at least the strategic dynamic I was thinking of, was that of President Kennedy in the early 1960s and our involvement in Vietnam, where one of the things Kennedy is, after the Eisenhower administration was very concerned about, because he was a relatively young president, was being perceived as weak on the Soviet Union. And his fear of being perceived as weak made him feel as though he couldn't withdraw from Vietnam, and led to our continued troop presence there. So again, in this book, though, it's very much a character-driven book, and there is, throughout the narrative, you'll see a desire to get into the minds of these characters. And that includes the president, who is more of an ancillary character, but also really the five principal characters in the novel, who have a range of a variety of backgrounds, some Americans, some Chinese, Iranians, and others.
There are any number of nations involved in this story, but of course China is the main one that I guess you could say was the aggressor in the story. Why did you go for China as opposed to Russia or North Korea or Iran? And parenthetically, might add that I was really interested in the fact that you still got Vladimir Putin in charge of Russia in 2034, so he'll be happy to know that. But why did you go with China?
Well, I think right now, when you look around the world, China represents the most significant threat to the United States by far. It is our nearest peer-level nation, both economically, also now militarily. The Chinese Navy, for instance, today is larger than the United States Navy. I think one can argue that the caliber of U.S. Navy ships exceeds that of Chinese ships, but there are number by number more Chinese ships, and that we have a real flashpoint that exists right now in the South China Sea, in Taiwan. And, oh, by the way, to cap it all off, and this is a new development, meaning it preceded the writing of this book, we're also coming out of a global pandemic that started in China. So how the United States navigates its relationship with China in the next 15 to 20 years is going to be of the utmost importance in how the 21st century develops.
I was interested in seeing the pandemic reference in the book. I'm wondering if the severity of the U.S. response to what China does in the book is because of, in part, lingering ill will from the pandemic.
We began writing the book before the pandemic. So, and there are a couple of areas in the book where sort of real life events we had to contend with them as we were putting this book together because they sort of overtook the narratives that we were playing out. I would say I don't look at China as being necessarily a villain in this book. There really are no villains. And for instance, the Chinese characters, when they step onto the page, and they make their case to the reader, and they're making their case to the reader like they're making their case before God, you see how they view the world. And if we've done our job well, you'll be able to understand how they view the world and how they understand that U.S. naval patrols in the South China Sea, which are right up to their shores, they view as very aggressive, and how they view the United States as hypocritical in some ways. So they get to make their case. The Americans make their case. Without giving too much away, nuclear weapons are employed in this book. The Americans are the ones who strike first. So we're trying to create something that's realistic. If there is a villain in this book, the villain is war itself. And if there's a message, the message is that war should be avoided at all costs.
At the center of this story, of course, is technology, cyber warfare, really. Do we need a cyber force?
I would say that we do. I think this is going to be, and already is, frankly, a critical space in our national defense. I mean, in 2 words, right? Solar winds. Just this year alone, 400 of the Fortune 500 companies were hacked into by the Russians. Additionally, that hack penetrated vast swaths of our U.S. cyber infrastructure. Both the United States and China and other nations have the capability to completely cripple one another's infrastructure, whether it's our electric grids, our power supply. So the challenge that exists with cyber, though, it is not something we can easily see. Most Americans don't understand the scope of the threat because the threat is not necessarily visible. But that doesn't mean it is not as existential as threats that we knew before, for instance, like the nuclear threat. And I think it's high time that we put in place the essential methods of deterrence that we will need to avoid such a catastrophic effect. So we are very much entering into a type of new Cold War with China, but the frontier is not just nuclear, it also includes cyber, and we need to shore up our cyber vulnerabilities.
Would there be such a thing as mutually assured destruction working to keep these cyber wars in check as it's done with nuclear war?
I think what the current, if I were in the current administration right now, I think we need to be making the moves and the overtures to our peer level adversaries in the realm of cyber to establish basically regimes of mutually assured deterrence. So they very clearly know that if they strike us, we will strike them, and we will be able to wipe one another out and assure that those attacks never happen. But again, I think for many Americans, the challenge has been this is more difficult to conceptualize, but the threat is every bit as profound.
Yeah, I opened my Facebook account today, and on the page was a reminder that it was 2 years ago today that we interviewed Janet Napolitano on this program about her book. And one of the points that she made about her selection as Homeland Security Secretary by President Obama was that he thought that she had a very dark imagination, which she took as a compliment. Do we have enough people in Washington with dark imaginations, or do we need to find some? Because this is a pretty dark story.
I don't know if it's necessarily dark imaginations, although I appreciate what you're saying with Napolitano, but just imagination in general, right? The writer George Saunders, who I admire, said recently of this past year, 2020, that 2020 is a year represented a failure in American storytelling, meaning the stories that we tell ourselves were insufficient to the challenge of that year. And I think whether it's imagination or the stories we're telling ourselves about ourselves, it's important we get those stories right. So specifically, if America right now is continuing to tell itself a story about American global dominance, our lack of susceptibility to any threat, and that there is no nation on earth that can compete with us militarily or economically, and we continue to be the single great power in the world, that is probably a story that is going to get us in a lot of trouble. I think we need to recognize the fact that we do have peer competitors, both militarily and in issues like cyber, and that we need to be imagining how those threats could manifest to compromise our national security. Like to give you one specific example of American storytelling, do you ever see the series Band of Brothers?
Yes, on HBO, yeah.
HBO, great series. I would argue that series, captures a type of zeitgeist that doesn't so much exist today around the wars, the greatest generation. That was a story that we were telling ourselves a while ago, but we don't seem to be telling to ourselves as much today. I've always thought it was very fascinating that Band of Brothers premiered on HBO on September 10th, 2001. So the story we were telling ourselves right before 9/11 was sort of a throwback to the Second World War, and that was who we were and we're going to be. So what are the stories we're telling ourselves right now? Oftentimes we're not cognizant of what those stories are, and I think it's important that we are to allow us to imagine our way out of future threats.
Well, and I suppose one of the many terrifying scenarios is a combination of the nuclear and the cyber war. At one point in the book, you talk about cyber weapons being used to turn smart bombs not into dumb bombs, but into brain-dead bombs.
Right.
I suppose that's a real possibility. At SolarWinds, I mean, they didn't launch anything, obviously, but they started to get into that part of the defense system.
I think it's interesting, and the book very much deals with technology, but this idea that technology sometimes isn't enough, right? It's not enough that you have the most state-of-the-art technology. You also have to have the right technology for the moment. Like, for example, if you're a student of history, you might know that in the 15th century, there was the Battle of Agincourt. If you remember the Battle of Agincourt, that's when a group of heavily armored French knights tried to rush across a muddy field and attack a bunch of unarmored English longbowmen. Well, the English longbowmen won that battle because they had a bunch of arrows. So did it matter that the French knights had the most state-of-the-art armor in the world? No, not at all, because they bogged down in the mud and were killed by something as basic as a bow and arrow. So you've got to have the right technology, too.
Yeah, you seem to be making a case a little bit in the book for having too much technology is a bad thing. First of all, it makes us vulnerable because we're so reliant on technology, but that it's technology at the cost of perhaps really knowing what to do if you don't have that technology available to you. Your hero of the story, one of them, is the Major Chris Mitchell. Wedge. I kept wanting to say Wedge. It's his nickname. But, his plane gets taken over and he ends up in Iran as a prisoner. Do the military services teach pilots, captains, so forth, how to work without all that technology in case there is some sort of a breach?
Yes, increasingly so now. I think the word, I don't know if it is a word, but you get my meaning, is primitivization. So we are making things more primitive again. I think that is a somewhat newer development. For instance, midshipmen learning how to navigate by sextant, which is something that 15 years ago they weren't learning to do, but now they've gone back and learned how to do that. Or in my case, I was a Marine lieutenants learning how to go on patrol without just a GPS, but also using an old lensatic compass. So that's very important because it's not just the technology isn't enough. You can have the technology, but you also have to have the ability to be adaptive. And if you're totally reliant on the technology, you lose your ability to adapt. And so I think we are seeing a combined focus on technology and the ability of leaders to adapt in the field when that technology is not working.
Well, and I may be conflating two things here that really don't have anything to do with each other, but for the moment I'm going to think that they do. In the book, you have the F-35 is the plane that the Major is flying that gets taken over technologically. The F-35 is an actual plane that I think recently was dubbed a failure because it had too much technology and it wasn't working.
Well, without getting into too many details of the book, I will say that the first aircraft you see in this book in Chapter 1 is a state-of-the-art F-35, which are currently in use now, although the acquisition process of the F-35 was long and painful and over budget. But the last airframe you see being used in the book is a first-generation F-18 Hornet from about circa 1990. So you see a process of these characters having to adapt to the fact that their technology, their state-of-the-art technology, is no longer doing what they want to do. So they kind of have to go back in and bring out the old stuff.
It's interesting. You get into some inner monologues of some of the Chinese characters in this and some of their statements as well. One is about that 1,000 years from now, America will no longer exist. But the one that really jumped out at me is the Chinese, I guess he's the admiral, the Chinese admiral saying that America will do what always happens is it will collapse from within, which is a scary enough thought just in the abstract. But given what we've seen lately, and I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but I mean, is that the sort of thing he might have meant?
I think that character, that's very much what he is alluding to. And there's a part in the book where he quotes Abraham Lincoln, who expressed a similar sentiment in 1860 in the speech that he gave. Basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but Lincoln basically said that, the greatest army on the earth could not come to the United States and take a drink from the Ohio River, that Americans are going to live as free men throughout all times or die by suicide. And that idea that as much as this book is a book that is focused on external threats to the United States, is manifest by a Chinese threat, a Russian threat, an Iranian threat, that the United States' ability to navigate those threats is very much contingent upon its ability to hold together at home.
You may not want to go here, but I'll just ask anyway, since I have the advantage of having you here as not only someone who was in the military, but as a journalist who's covered the military. Going back to what we were just talking about, did you notice or have any concerns when you were in the military about other members of the military and some extremist views? Because we saw on January 6th, several of the people who attacked the Capitol were ex-military. Is that a concern or just a coincidence?
I would not say that I observed that when I was in the military. I will say just myself personally as a citizen, I am, and I don't say this from a perspective of being on the left or a perspective on being on the right. I say this as a perspective of just being a U.S. citizen, that if you look back in history, the combination of having a very large standing military in a republic where the politics are dysfunctional, the internal politics are dysfunctional. I think we could say our internal politics right now are pretty dysfunctional. That combination, large military, dysfunctional politics, in history, it doesn't go well. And so I am concerned about that as an issue in the United States, that the military right now seems to be one of the only institutions that has yet to be overtly politicized. And heaven help us if we try to politicize our military.
We were talking before about having a dark imagination. Does the Pentagon ever call on folks like yourself to kind of help them game out some possible scenarios that maybe they aren't creative enough to think about?
Well, I worked for the Pentagon for a number of years for the Department of Defense.
You being the notable exception of having already been there.
Sure. And I've heard from a number of people who work in government who have read this book, enjoyed this book. So in that way, yes, and they certainly do have top minds that think about issues such as China, cyber, and what the next threats are that are to come to the United States. Whether or not those voices that have the most foresight are always listened to, that's usually the challenge. It's not that no one is saying what's coming next. I mean, there were people who were predicting a pandemic. The problem was no one was listening to them.
For the longest time, I remember even before 1984 and for years after 1984, that people were always referencing that novel as some sort of a yardstick about the dystopian future that we might face. I'm wondering if you think there's a chance that 2034 might become sort of that same kind of a yardstick.
Well, I think that the book and choosing a year for the title is a nice way to kind of put a marker on the wall, and it also places the book within a literary tradition that, yes, obviously there's Orwell's 1984. There's also Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I think as the date approaches, you can always say, well, is this what it's really going to be like when the year hits? And frequently, it's not exactly what that narrative is, but then when you look back at it, it is a nice way to think about how people were imagining these events in the past as we try to imagine our future.
You have a co-author on this book, Admiral James Stavridis. How did it come to be that you had a co-author? How does that work as sort of a process question here, I guess? Does someone write one chapter and someone write the other chapter? And also, did one of you have the idea and bring it to the other, or what got you guys onto this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So this book was absolutely a total partnership, and originally it was Admiral Stavridis' idea. His idea was, let's write a book that imagines a war between the U.S. and China, primarily at sea, in 2034. And so he approached our shared editor at Penguin Press with this idea, who said, well, love the idea, totally understand what the tradition that you'd be writing into. I think it would be great if you worked with a novelist. And aren't you and Elliot friends? And so the Admiral and I had known each other for the better part of a decade. We're both graduates of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where he was later the dean. And when he was the dean, he brought me on for a semester to serve as writer in residence. And when he asked me to do this, he gave me a bullet point list of my responsibilities, one of which was talk to the dean about books when he feels like it. So Jim's a very deeply read guy, and we would sit around, talk about books. We shared an editor. So I very much knew his sensibility. And so when, the idea of working together on this project came up, I was very excited, and we had very much a shared vision of what the book could be. And so it was a lot of fun writing it. In terms of process, we would sit there and, each chapter, we did it by chapters. And, we would just go in a lot of detail, outline every single chapter, write it, kick it back and forth between the two of us. When we thought it was in good shape, then we'd move to the next chapter.
Did a lot of the ideas in this come from perhaps some frustration you might have had when you were in the military about things like drawing red lines that then get erased or skipped over, things like that?
I wouldn't say like frustration. There was no score or anything I think anyone was trying to settle in this book. I think it's really a accumulation of our experiences. I could go in and point to various spots in the book that, this is something drawing from my experience. This is something that's directly drawn from Jim's experience. And, then obviously whole facets of the book that are just completely imagined from whole cloth. So the book's very much a combination of our imaginations and experience.
I was struck by the fact in the book you point out, I assume it's a fact, that the word in Chinese for crisis is the same word as opportunity. Is that real? Because that's kind of fascinating.
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm. And the idea also coming out of that, which is, never let a crisis go to waste.
Well, sort of just by way of wrapping up, this, not to make light of it, but it sounds like something would make a surefire hit movie. Has anybody talked about that?
We have a few people who are interested in it. So, we'll see. Fingers crossed, but, you never know.
Who would you have play Wedge?
I've joked with the Admiral about this because one or two people have asked us this question. I finally came to the consensus that, if this was a film, I decided that he and I would kind of tackle the project like Arsenio Hall and Eddie Murphy, and we would just play every role just wearing lots of makeup. Well,
the book is 2034. Hopefully you're wrong about all of this and none of it comes true. But, boy, it seems like it's really on point. And it's also available, again, folks, at Left Bank Books in the Central West End. Elliot Ackerman, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I like to say, for a grim book, we had a lot of fun writing it.